The generation that fought the revolution and established the Constitution had secured independence, but they had also unleashed ideas that would transcend their own era. The American experiment, born in defiance of monarchy, presented to the world an unprecedented model of government based on consent, rather than coercion. The legacy of the revolution reverberated through every aspect of political, social, and intellectual life, shaping both the identity of the United States and the wider course of global history. The immediate legacy of the revolution was political. By demonstrating that a colonial people could successfully overthrow a European empire and sustain a republican government, the United States challenged assumptions about hierarchy and legitimacy that had dominated the Old World for centuries. In Europe, reformers and radicals alike looked to America as evidence that natural rights could be institutionalized. The French Revolution, beginning in 1789, drew direct inspiration from American principles, although its course soon diverged into violence and authoritarianism. In Latin America, leaders such as Simón Bolívar cited the American struggle as precedent for independence movements across the Spanish Empire. The global spread of republican ideals owed much to the symbolic power of the American Revolution, which redefined sovereignty as the collective will of the people, rather than the divine right of kings. The rhetoric of equality and liberty clashed with the persistence of slavery and the subordination of women. Even as the Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men are created equal, 1/5 of the new nation's population remained in bondage. Some contemporaries recognized the inconsistency. Northern states, where slavery was less entrenched economically, began gradual emancipation. Quakers and abolitionists denounced the institution as incompatible with republican virtue. Yet in the South, the invention of the cotton gin in 1793 revitalized slave labor, entrenching slavery more deeply than ever before. The paradox of a republic built on freedom yet sustained by bondage would become the central moral and political challenge of the next century. During the Revolution, many indigenous nations had allied with Britain, perceiving the crown as a lesser threat than the land-hungry settlers. The Northwest Indian War, 1785-1795, and later conflicts underscored that the new republic's vision of liberty was primarily for its settlers. Women, too, found themselves on the margins of the new political order. They had contributed to independence through boycotts, fundraising, and even direct participation in war. Yet the laws of the Republic denied them formal citizenship. Nevertheless, the revolution opened intellectual space for new discussions of gender and education. The ideal of Republican motherhood held that women, as the first educators of future citizens, required knowledge and virtue, laying foundations for later movements. Although the revolution did not immediately transform gender relations, it planted the seeds of change. Religious life in the post-revolutionary era underwent profound transformation. The disestablishment of churches in most states and the guarantee of religious freedom in the First Amendment created an unprecedented landscape of pluralism. This democratization of faith mirrored the political democracy of the nation, reinforcing the belief that conscience was sovereign. The alliance between religion and republican virtue gave moral weight to emerging reform movements, including abolitionism, temperance, and women's rights. Economically, the revolution's impact was both disruptive and transformative. The break from the British Empire severed colonial trade networks, forcing Americans to develop domestic industries and new international relationships. The early republic's economy remained largely agricultural, but it began to diversify. Entrepreneurs, protected by tariffs and encouraged by Hamiltonian policies, established textile mills and workshops that signaled the dawn of industrialization. The expansion of internal markets through roads, canals, and later railways bound the nation together in commerce as it had been bound in revolution. At the same time, the availability of Western land offered social mobility for white settlers, reinforcing the ideal of independence through property ownership. Yet this prosperity was unevenly distributed. For enslaved Africans, displaced natives, and impoverished laborers, the promise of freedom often remained abstract. Culturally, the early republic sought to define a national identity distinct from European models. The arts, literature, and education became vehicles for expressing civic virtue and unity. Noah Webster's dictionaries standardized American English, while painters such as John Trumbull depicted heroic scenes of the Revolution to instill patriotic pride. The founding generation understood that a republic required not only institutions, but also a shared narrative, a sense of belonging to a collective destiny. Schools and newspapers proliferated, and literacy rates remained high. ensuring that political debate reached wide audiences. The press became a forum for vigorous partisanship, reflecting both the vitality and volatility of democratic life. The new nation's foreign policy further defined its place in the world. The United States, weak militarily but rich in ideals, navigated a precarious path between European powers. The conflict ended in stalemate, but the mere endurance of the Republic against the world's strongest empire enhanced national confidence. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823 declared the Western Hemisphere closed to further European colonization, signaling America's growing self-perception as a protector of republicanism in the New World. Yet this assertion of hemispheric influence foreshadowed future debates over imperialism and moral responsibility. Thinkers such as Jefferson and Madison continued to argue for limited government and education as pillars of liberty. Meanwhile, the transcendentalists Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and others recast the revolutionary emphasis on self-determination into a spiritual doctrine of individual conscience. Their writings in the mid-19th century linked political freedom to moral autonomy, shaping the language of later reform and resistance. Thus, the Revolution's intellectual legacy was not confined to politics. It fostered an enduring culture of questioning authority and celebrating human potential. Beyond its borders, the example of the United States forced monarchies to confront new realities. European conservatives viewed the Republic with suspicion, associating it with instability and radicalism. Yet even they could not ignore its success. The survival and gradual expansion of the American system demonstrated that representative government could coexist with order, prosperity, and moral seriousness. In the 19th century, nationalist movements in Greece, Italy, and South America cited the American Revolution as precedent, while African and Asian intellectuals later adapted its ideals to their own struggles for self-determination. The phrase "government by the people" became part of a universal vocabulary of freedom. At home, however, the tension between the revolution's promise and its reality deepened. The territorial expansion that followed the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 and the conquest of lands from Mexico in 1848 extended the reach of the Republic but reignited debates over slavery's extension. Each new state forced the nation to confront the moral contradiction at its heart. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, temporarily balancing slave and free states, revealed how fragile the Union remained. The Revolution had established a framework for political equality among citizens, but it had not resolved the question of who qualified as a citizen. Native removal, the perpetuation of slavery, and the exclusion of women from political rights all testified to the limits of the founding vision. The Civil War, less than a century after independence, would become the ultimate reckoning of those contradictions, second birth of freedom that sought to realize the first. The Revolution's influence on global thought cannot be overstated. It redefined concepts of legitimacy, citizenship, and rights that continue to shape political discourse today. By asserting that government derives its authority from the governed, it provided a philosophical foundation for democratic movements worldwide. Yet it also revealed the complexities of applying universal ideals in diverse societies. The American founders believed that virtue was essential for liberty. Without moral discipline, freedom could degenerate into chaos. This tension between liberty and virtue, rights and responsibilities, remains central to democratic governance. In retrospect, the birth of America represents both culmination and commencement. It was the culmination of centuries of European exploration, colonization, and cultural exchange that had transformed the Atlantic world. But it was also the commencement of a new historical phase of modern age, in which the legitimacy of rule would depend on consent, and the measure of greatness would rest not in conquest but in justice. The Revolution's enduring power lies in its ability to inspire continual self-examination. Every generation of Americans has revisited its principles, testing whether the Republic still honors its founding promise. They sought recognition of their dignity as rational beings capable of self-government. Their success reshaped the political imagination of the world. Yet their work remained unfinished. Freedom, they learned, was not a destination but a process fragile, demanding, and perpetually renewed. The story of America's birth is not merely the tale of a political revolution, but a profound transformation in the human conception of authority, community, and purpose. The movement from colonies to freedom represented the first large-scale experiment in applying Enlightenment principles to the structure of a real society. Its success and contradictions became a mirror through which later generations would contemplate both the possibilities and perils of freedom. In the long perspective of history, the American Revolution signified a shift from empire to self-rule, from inherited hierarchy to civic equality, from subjects to citizens. Yet these transitions were neither absolute nor untroubled. The independence declared in 1776 and secured in 1783 had to be internalized within the hearts and habits of a diverse people. Building a republic required more than institutions. It required a transformation of character. The early leaders understood this. They believed that liberty could not endure without virtue, that citizens must exercise reason, self-restraint, and civic responsibility. George Washington's farewell address, John Adams's warnings against faction, and Jefferson's emphasis on education all reflected the conviction that freedom demanded moral discipline. The republic's endurance would depend not only on law, but on the habits of the people. Over the centuries that followed, America's foundational ideals have undergone reinterpretation. The assertion that all men are created equal expanded gradually to include groups once excluded from its promise. The abolition of slavery through the Civil War and the 13th Amendment marked the first major fulfillment of that principle. The Reconstruction Amendments, the 14th and 15th extended citizenship and suffrage to formerly enslaved persons, translating the rhetoric of 1776 into constitutional reality. The struggle for women's suffrage, culminating in the 19th Amendment in 1920, further broadened the definition of political equality. The civil rights movement of the 20th century invoked the same revolutionary creed to demand its completion. Each generation, by challenging the limits of the founders' vision, renewed the revolution's moral vitality. Internationally, the birth of America introduced a new vocabulary of legitimacy. Monarchies, colonial administrations, and autocracies could no longer justify themselves solely by tradition or divine sanction. They were compelled to confront the question of consent. The spread of Republican and nationalist movements in the 19th and 20th centuries drew upon the American example. Even when rejecting its specific institutions, the democratic revolutions of 1848 in Europe, the independence struggles of Latin America and Asia, and the wave of decolonization after World War II all reflected, in part, the intellectual inheritance of 1776. The United States became both model and paradox, a symbol of freedom that was itself entangled in empire, capitalism, and inequality. The American founding also redefined the relationship between the individual and the state. The Constitution balanced liberty with order through a system of checks and balances. But the cultural imagination of the nation emphasized the autonomy of the individual. From frontier expansion to industrial innovation, Americans celebrated initiative and self-reliance. This ethos fueled progress, but also bred tensions between private interest and public good. The expansion of markets and technology increased wealth yet deepened social disparities. The same entrepreneurial spirit that conquered the continent and sent machines into the sky often obscured the communal virtues upon which republicanism depended. The challenge, persistent from the 18th century to the present, has been to harmonize freedom with justice, to ensure that liberty for some does not become oppression for others. The philosophical influence of the American Revolution reached beyond politics into the realm of human consciousness. It encouraged belief in human perfectibility, the idea that reason and education could elevate mankind. It fostered a secular faith in progress and moral improvement. These convictions would shape the reform movements of the 19th century: abolition, temperance, women's rights, and public education, and, later, the scientific and humanitarian endeavors of the modern world. Yet they also carried dangers. The belief in progress sometimes became arrogance, leading to cultural imperialism or blind confidence in technology. The same Enlightenment rationalism that produced emancipation also produced systems of control and exploitation. America's challenge has been to balance idealism with humility, to pursue advancement without forgetting the moral responsibilities of power. Culturally, the revolution gave rise to a distinctive American identity. The new republic was conceived as a civic rather than ethnic community, defined by allegiance to principles rather than lineage. This concept allowed for diversity and adaptation, but it also required continual negotiation of belonging. Waves of immigration throughout the 19th and 20th centuries tested the inclusiveness of the national ideal. Immigrants from Ireland, Germany, Italy, Eastern Europe, Asia, and Latin America each redefined what it meant to be American. The promise of opportunity drew millions, yet prejudice and exclusion revealed the incompleteness of the founding creed. The tension between universal ideals and particular identities remains one of the central features of the nation's ongoing evolution. The modern American state, with its vast institutions and global influence, differs radically from the small agrarian republic imagined by the founders. Yet the moral questions that confronted the first generation persist. What is the proper balance between liberty and security, individual rights and collective welfare, national interest and universal justice? These debates, whether over economic policy, social reform, or foreign intervention, all trace their ancestry to the dilemmas of the founding era. The Constitution's durability lies in its capacity to contain such disputes within a framework of law rather than force. The very act of disagreement, conducted through elections, courts, and the press, embodies the freedom that the revolution sought to preserve. From a global perspective, America's journey from colonies to freedom illustrates the dialectic of power and principle that defines modern history. The revolution proclaimed the equality of man, yet the republic became a world power whose economic and military reach has often contradicted its ideals. This duality, the coexistence of aspiration and imperfection, has made the United States both admired and criticized. To its supporters, it represents the practical realization of liberty. To its detractors, the hypocrisy of empire cloaked in rhetoric. Both perspectives contain truth. The enduring lesson of America's birth is that ideals, once released into the world, cannot be fully contained by any single nation. They transcend boundaries and demand accountability even from their originators. The intellectual legacy of the revolution also reshaped historical consciousness itself. It invited people to see history not as cyclical or predetermined, but as open and progressive. The idea that societies could remake themselves through collective will replaced fatalism with agency. This belief energized not only political revolutions, but also movements for scientific discovery, humanitarian reform, and social equality. The notion that the future could be improved by human efforts, so central to modernity, found its earliest democratic expression in the American experience. Yet the revolution's meaning cannot be confined to triumphal narratives. Its true significance lies in the tension between principle and practice, between what was achieved and what remains unfinished. The founders created mechanisms for debate, reform, but they could not foresee every injustice or challenge. Each generation must interpret the promise of freedom anew, applying it to circumstances they could not imagine. Industrialization, global war, digital technology, environmental crisis. The continuity of American history resides not in static perfection but in perpetual striving. Reflecting on this legacy requires acknowledging the darker dimensions of the nation's birth. The same independence that liberated one people from imperial rule brought displacement and destruction to indigenous nations. The same rhetoric of liberty coexisted with the enslavement of millions. These contradictions do not negate the revolution's achievement, but they compel humility. They remind us that freedom is not a possession, but a practice, a discipline that demands empathy, inclusion, and vigilance. The moral measure of any nation lies in how it confronts its own inconsistencies. In the 21st century, the principles articulated in 1776 continue to resonate across the globe. In movements for democracy, civil rights, and human dignity, echoes of the American Revolution are unmistakable, yet its lessons are more complex than simple celebration. It teaches that liberty requires constant negotiation, that equality demands continual expansion, and that justice is a horizon rather than a destination. The revolution's enduring gift is the framework it left behind, a set of ideas, consent rights, accountability through which humanity can critique and improve itself. In the grand sweep of history, the transformation of 13 scattered colonies into a self-governing republic stands as one of civilization's defining episodes. It signaled the dawn of an age in which legitimacy would depend on the governed, not the ruler. In which the pursuit of happiness would be recognized as a natural aspiration, rather than a privilege. The birth of America did not create a perfect world, but it expanded the realm of the possible. It gave substance to the belief that human beings, through reason and courage, could shape their destiny. Ultimately, the journey from colonies to freedom is a story of faith in the capacity of ordinary people to govern themselves, to learn from their errors, and to reach beyond the boundaries of their time. That faith, tested by war, division, and doubt, endures as the Republic's most precious inheritance. Every crisis, every reform, every debate renews the revolution in spirit, proving that freedom's flame, once kindled, can survive the tempests of history. The birth of America was not the end of dependence, but the beginning of responsibility. It challenged humanity to imagine politics as the art of mutual respect, power as a trust, and justice as a shared pursuit. The colonists who became citizens could not have foreseen the vast consequences of their rebellion. Yet their experiment in self-government continues to define the world's moral vocabulary. The transformation they initiated from subjects to sovereigns, from obedience to reason, remains the foundation of modern liberty. To say that America was born from colonies to freedom is to acknowledge a process still unfolding. Freedom, once achieved, demands preservation. Equality, once proclaimed, demands realization. The revolution's promise endures not in monuments or anniversaries, but in the daily acts of participation and conscience that keep democracy alive. In every generation, the question posed in 1776, whether people can truly govern themselves, must be answered again. And so, the story continues. The winds that carried fragile ships across the Atlantic in the 17th century now echo in the aspirations of billions seeking dignity and voice. The same hope that lit the fires of resistance in Boston and Philadelphia burns in every heart that refuses subjugation. From colonies to freedom, the phrase itself captures the arc of humanity's enduring journey, from dependence toward self-determination. The birth of America was but one chapter in that universal story, a testament to what is possible when courage meets conviction, and when ideals are given the chance to live.